November the 2nd, 1944, Walcheren Island, at the mouth of the Scheldt. A cold wind drives rain in from the North Sea. Amphibious tracked vehicles grind up out of the flooded shallows. Canadian infantry, British commandos, and Royal Marines step down into waist-deep water and move toward concrete gun positions, covering the only deep water approach to Antwerp. Hundreds of kilometers away, trains and trucks all across France are already straining to feed and fuel entire armies over roads that were never designed for that load. On these grey beaches and dikes, the battle here decides whether the rest of the Allied army can keep moving. If this drowned Dutch landscape cannot be taken, Antwerp stays closed, and if Antwerp stays closed, the Allied advance slows to a crawl. The fight for the Scheldt would fall largely to 1st Canadian Army, even as senior British commanders, including Bernard Montgomery, complained that the Canadians were too slow and too cautious. At first, clearing these flooded dikes and islands looked like a sideshow beside the drive toward Germany. Yet the success here would decide whether his own army group could be kept supplied through the winter. 2 months earlier, on September 4th, 1944, British armoured units of 11th Armoured Division drove into Antwerp and captured the port installations largely intact. To planners at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, this looked like a gift. A vast, modern, deep-water port much closer to the front than the beaches in Normandy. There was a catch. Antwerp sits inland, and to reach the North Sea ships have to move along the Scheldt estuary, a twisting channel bordered by low Dutch islands and reclaimed farmland. By early September, the whole seaward approach was still under German control, with artillery on both shores, minefields in the water, and flooded polders that made it impossible for Allied shipping to enter. In practical terms, the Allies had taken a harbour, but not the sea gate that would make it usable. At the same time, Allied spearheads in France and Belgium were racing east. American Third Army was pushing toward the Moselle. British formations of 21st Army Group were moving through Belgium and the southern Netherlands. Fuel and ammunition had to come forward from Normandy over roads clogged with traffic, in American sectors through truck convoys that became known as the Red Ball Express. The distances were long, the roads were often poor, and vehicle wear, fuel usage, and driver fatigue were severe. Antwerp seemed to offer a clear solution: shorten the supply routes, feed the advance directly from a major port, and keep operations going into 1945. To achieve that, someone would have to clear the Scheldt approaches. The Allied command structure in northwest Europe added another layer of complexity. At the top sat General Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander. Under him, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded 21st Army Group, which included British, 2nd Army, and the multinational 1st Canadian Army. 1st Canadian Army, under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, was Canadian in title, but contained British, Polish, and other Allied formations, as well as Canadian divisions. It had already fought hard around Caen and enclosing the Falaise pocket in Normandy. National pride rode on how it performed. Canada had mobilized a large force for its population, had been at war since 1939, and had taken heavy casualties in Europe and the Atlantic. Canadian political and military leaders wanted their own army command to be seen as more than a name on an organization chart. Montgomery faced his own pressures. His public reputation rested on victories in North Africa and on his prominent role in Normandy. He argued for a concentrated thrust into Germany through the north, led by his army group and aimed at the Ruhr and perhaps Berlin. And that thinking lay behind Operation Market Garden in September 1944. That created a clash of priorities. Montgomery wanted to seize a crossing over the Rhine and keep the offensive moving. Naval and logistics specialists, including Admiral Bertram Ramsay and officers on Eisenhower's staff, kept warning that clearing the Scheldt and opening Antwerp had to come first. For several important weeks after Antwerp fell, formations under Montgomery advanced deep into the Netherlands, while German 15th Army was able to withdraw in relatively good order across the Scheldt and dig in along its shores and islands. Many historians later judged that delay to have made the coming battle around the estuary significantly harder. Tension inside the Allied camp grew as 1st Canadian Army and attached forces were told to clear the Channel coast and then the Scheldt, tasks that looked less dramatic than the dash toward the German frontier but proved extremely costly. When progress in the Scheldt area was slow in difficult conditions, Contemporary accounts record Montgomery complaining sharply about the army's performance. His relationship with Crerar had already been damaged by a fierce argument in early September over Crerar's decision to attend a Dieppe commemoration instead of a market garden planning conference. None of this was a simple story of heroes and villains. Montgomery did have real operational concerns and believed that speed was essential. Crerar, who answered to the Canadian government as well as to Montgomery, was alert to how Canadian formations were being used and how they were viewed. Eisenhower, trying to balance American and British expectations against hard supply limits, had to decide where to put his main weight of resources. The choices that followed shaped the coming battle for the Scheldt. By the middle of September 1944, supply problems were already acute. The Normandy beaches and the port of Cherbourg could no longer support both a broad advance and large stockpiles for the winter. On September 20th, 1944, Eisenhower wrote to Montgomery stressing that clearing the approaches to Antwerp had become urgent. On October 9, 1944, he went further in a personal directive, telling Montgomery that free use of Antwerp was now vital to Allied operations, and that clearing the Scheldt approaches had absolute priority over other tasks in the north. From then on, the Canadian-led forces on the Scheldt were treated as the main offensive effort in that part of the theatre, rather than as a secondary clearing job. There was another complication. In late September 1944, Crerar fell ill with a serious intestinal infection and had to leave the front for medical treatment in Britain. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the Secours Canadian Corps, took over as acting commander of 1st Canadian Army. Crerar remained the Army's official commander and an important symbol of Canadian control, but in practice it was Simonds who planned and directed most of the Scheldt fighting on the ground. The German position around the Scheldt was formidable. The withdrawal across the estuary had concentrated much of German 15th Army in this region. Its commander, General Gustav Adolf von Zangen, had tens of thousands of troops, backed by artillery and coastal batteries that covered the sea approaches and the low-lying country on both banks. German engineers had also opened dikes and flooded large areas, turning flat farmland into shallow lakes and mudflats. That landscape was ideal for defense and extremely difficult for attackers who had to move along the remaining high ground and narrow causeways. Under Guy Simonds, 1st Canadian Army staff broke the problem into a series of linked operations, each with its own code name. The first was Operation Switchback, the attack on what came to be known as the Breskens Pocket. South of the Scheldt estuary, between the Leopold Canal and the sea, German forces held a bridgehead that threatened the southern bank of the estuary and blocked the route toward the Dutch islands. Operation Switchback began on October 6, 1944, and aimed to clear this pocket. 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, veterans of Juno Beach, fought its way forward across flooded ground, canals and dikes, supported by artillery and specialized engineer and armored units. Progress was slow and costly. Small villages, ditches and farm buildings were turned into strongpoints. Assaulting troops often had to move in water up to their waists under machine gun and mortar fire. There was no room for sweeping armored maneuver, only methodical advances and bitter close-range fighting. By November 3, 1944, organized resistance in the Breskens Pocket had been broken and thousands of German soldiers taken prisoner, but the cost in Canadian and attached Allied casualties was high. The next step was Operation Vitality against the South Beveland Peninsula north of the estuary. South Beveland juts out toward Walcheren and could be reached either along a narrow causeway or from the water. A direct assault over the causeway would have meant attacking along a very confined strip under heavy fire. Simonds and his planners decided on a mixed approach. Operation Vitality combined pressure along the land route with amphibious moves that used tracked amphibious vehicles and landing craft to outflank German positions. This is where the specialized Buffalo amphibious tractors became essential. These LVT-4 vehicles, originally developed for island operations in the Pacific, could swim, climb out of the water, and continue across mud and flooded fields where ordinary armor would bog down. By this stage of the war, they were part of the wider Allied engineer and armored toolkit, notably within Britain's 79th Armored Division and other formations earmarked for river crossing and coastal work, rather than a new personal invention by any one commander. Using these resources, Allied troops landed on the flanks of South Beveland, seized key ground, and helped push German forces back toward Walcheren. The peninsula was largely cleared by the end of October 1944. The final major obstacle was Walcheren Island itself. Walcheren dominated the Scheldt Channel with its coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns. Its defenses were strong, and much of the interior had already been flooded. To neutralize the island, Allied planners decided on a combination of bombing and amphibious assault. In October 1944, Bomber Command attacked the sea dikes at several points to open the island to the sea, and in the last days of October dropped more than 4,000 tons of bombs on Walcheren's coastal defenses. The result was a series of breaches and a heavily inundated interior that forced German troops onto the remaining higher ground and the surviving dikes. Operation Infatuate, the assault on Walcheren, began on November 1st, 1944. Royal Marine and Army commandos landed at West Capelle and near Flushing with support from Royal Navy warships, while other forces, including Canadian and British infantry, crossed from the mainland in Buffalo amphibious vehicles and landing craft. Fighting on the island was intense. The flooded ground channeled movement along dikes and causeways. German coastal guns inflicted heavy losses on ships and assault craft. House-to-house and bunker-to-bunker fighting gradually reduced the remaining strongpoints. By November 8, 1944, organized resistance on Walcheren had effectively ended, and German units there and in the last pockets along the estuary surrendered in large numbers. Taken together, the fighting for the Breskens Pocket, South Beveland, Walcheren, and the related operations that linked them ran from early October 1944 to early November 1944. Allied casualties in the Battle of the Scheldt were heavy, with about 20,873 killed, wounded, or missing, of whom 6,367 were Canadian. German losses included an estimated 10 to 13,000 killed or wounded, and more than 41,000 taken prisoner. Once Walcheren was secured, and the Scheldt Channel had been swept of mines, Antwerp could finally be brought into full use. On November 28, 1944, the first Allied convoy entered the port. Canadian sources at the time recorded that the convoy was led by the Canadian-built freighter Fort Cataraqui. And that same day, the American Liberty ship James B. Weaver arrived as the first United States Liberty ship to dock there with port troops and equipment. In his post-war reflections, Eisenhower described the moment when ships could move safely up the Scheldt as the point at which the end of German rule in Europe came clearly into sight. From late November 1944 through to the end of the war, Antwerp handled roughly 2.5 million tons of supplies for Allied forces in northwest Europe. Fuel, ammunition, vehicles, and food that had previously come forward over long road routes from Normandy now moved through this much closer deep water port. That shortened movement times, reduced strain on transport fleets, and made it easier to build up reserves for future operations. The importance of Antwerp became even clearer in December. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a major offensive through the Ardennes, the battle that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. During the fighting that followed, Allied armies consumed fuel and ammunition at a very high rate. The capacity of Antwerp allowed Eisenhower and his staff to keep frontline units supplied despite the surprise and scale of the German attack, and many logistics specialists and later, historians have argued that without Antwerp, the Allied position in the winter of 1944 to 1945 would have been significantly weaker, and the campaign in northwest Europe might well have lasted longer. That still does not mean that any one operation single-handedly decided the outcome. The final defeat of Germany depended on many interlocking campaigns and decisions across several fronts. But the clearance of the Scheldt and the opening of Antwerp were central pieces in sustaining the Allied advance in the last phase of the war. When we look at the main figures in this story, Harry Crerar returned from medical leave on November 7, 1944, just as the Battle of the Scheldt was ending. He resumed command of 1st Canadian Army and led it through later operations in the Rhineland and in the liberation of the northern Netherlands. And he was present when German forces in that area surrendered in May 1945. He never became a public figure on the level of Montgomery or Patton. Contemporary observers and later historians tend to describe his style as methodical, staff-oriented, and politically careful, and Canadian official histories generally credit him with building and managing a large multinational army in difficult coalition conditions. Guy Simons, who had served as acting army commander during the Scheldt operations, is widely seen as carrying much of the direct responsibility for the plan and its execution. He developed a reputation for an intellectually driven approach to operations and for a readiness to use unusual methods, such as extensive use of specialized armor and night attacks. And many scholars rate his handling of the Scheldt fighting as among the most technically accomplished of the Northwest Europe campaign. Bernard Montgomery's reputation in this context is more contested. His earlier successes in North Africa and his later role in crossing the Rhine and receiving the German surrender in the Northwest gave him a prominent place in British public memory. At the same time, his failure to give the Scheldt a higher priority in September 1944 and his decision to commit major resources to Operation Market Garden have drawn sustained criticism from naval and logistics experts, and from many historians who argue that if the Scheldt had been cleared sooner, Antwerp could have opened earlier, and Allied supply problems before winter would have been less severe. Accounts from the period also suggest that Montgomery's relations with Canadian commanders were often strained. He could be very blunt, and he did criticize the pace of 1st Canadian Army during the Scheldt fighting. But the surviving documents do not support a simple picture of him as fundamentally hostile to Canadian interests. His views were mixed, sometimes sharply critical, and at other times openly praising Canadian performance in official messages. Dwight Eisenhower's role over Antwerp shows both strengths and limits. In the end, he made clearance of the Scheldt the top operational priority in that sector, and, as we have seen, repeatedly stressed Antwerp's importance in his letters and directives. At the same time, he had previously authorized Market Garden and the continued push into the Netherlands that contributed to the delay in tackling the Scheldt problem. His position was less that of a single champion of any one national contingent, and more that of a coalition commander trying to balance American and British political expectations, national pride, and the hard facts of logistics. If we strip away invented conversations, imagined letters, and anonymous diarists, a few core points remain secure. First, 1st Canadian Army, a multinational formation under Canadian command, was given primary responsibility for clearing the Scheldt approaches to Antwerp in the autumn of 1944. Second, because of earlier operational choices and the time allowed for German withdrawals, that task had become much harder than it might have been, as 15th Army was able to pull back in reasonable order, fortify strong positions, and flood much of the ground. Third, under acting commander Guy Simons, Canadian and attached Allied units carried out a sequence of complex amphibious and land operations, including Switchback, Vitality, and Infatuate, in very difficult conditions, at high cost, and they eventually achieved their objectives. Fourth, the clearance of the Scheldt made it possible to open Antwerp to Allied shipping at the end of November 1944. And from then until the end of the war, the port handled millions of tons of supplies and was a key factor in sustaining Allied operations, including during the Battle of the Bulge. Finally, the whole episode highlighted differences in priorities within the Allied leadership and has remained central to later debates about Montgomery's judgment and the degree of recognition given to Canadian forces. What the record does not support are many of the highly dramatic personal scenes that sometimes appear in popular accounts, such as moments when Montgomery is said to have laughed in another commander's face, a word-for-word exchange in which Eisenhower supposedly accused him of fear or jealousy, or a private letter claiming that one general had saved the war on his own. Those belong more to the realm of historical fiction than to documented history. The story that can be traced through surviving orders, reports, and memoirs is already striking enough. It is a story of arguments over strategy, of flooded fields and amphibious vehicles working their way across dikes, of artillery duels across cold water, and of a major port that lay unused for nearly 3 months while frontline armies began to outrun their supplies. It is also a story of coalition warfare, of national pride, competing strategies, and the recurring difficulty of giving full credit to operations that are vital but not glamorous.